She does not believe the risk is worth the reward. The lemon's not worth the squeeze.
Stephanie White is sabotaging the Indiana Fever. Not accidentally, not through incompetence alone. Though the incompetence is catastrophic and undeniable, she is actively, deliberately, systematically dismantling the most exciting offensive weapon this franchise has ever had. And she is doing it in broad daylight, with cameras rolling, while the front office watches in total silence. The villain in this story has a name. The villain is Stephanie White, and today we are ripping the doors off of what she is actually building in Indianapolis, and why it is going to destroy this team. Welcome back. This is Rimrun, and today we are documenting the moment Stephanie White officially committed coaching malpractice against Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever.
Caitlin Clark should have had 40-point explosions, but
let me give you the stakes so you understand exactly what is on the line here. The Indiana Fever came into this season with the most watched, most discussed, most commercially significant player in the history of women's professional basketball sitting in their backcourt. Caitlin Clark, a player so transformative that she did not just change the Fever's attendance numbers. She changed the entire conversation about what the WNBA is and what it can become. She changed television ratings. She changed jersey sales. She changed the cultural footprint of the league itself. And what did Stephanie White do with that gift? She decided after a loss to the Atlanta Dream, after a performance that the whole world was watching, that the problem was Caitlin Clark, that the turnovers were disqualifying, that the risk was not worth the reward. And now, according to everything we are seeing and hearing, Stephanie White is pivoting back to isolation basketball, back to one-on-one dribble, pull-up and pray basketball, back to Kelsey Mitchell as the offensive priority, back to the system that produced 0 championships, 0 deep playoff runs, and 0 national relevance before Caitlin Clark walked through the door. Sit with that for a second, because what I am about to lay out for you is not a rumor, it is not speculation. It is a documented, sequential, pattern-based case that Stephanie White is the most dangerous person in Indiana Fever basketball right now, and Caitlin Clark is paying the price.
Skill, Aaliyah Boston has to get back to being a dominant in the paint player. Stephanie White has...
Let us go back to Atlanta. The Indiana Fever traveled to Atlanta to face the Dream, and what happened was not just a loss. It was an embarrassment, a town stomping, a complete and total meltdown on the road against a team the Fever had every reason to beat. And here is what makes the Atlanta disaster so damning. Not the final score, not the turnovers, not even the defensive collapse. What makes it damning is what Stephanie White did after the game. She stood in front of the media and she blamed Caitlin Clark. She pointed to the turnovers. She pointed to the mistakes. She made Caitlin Clark the story of a loss that had multiple contributing factors, multiple systemic failures, and a coaching staff that had no answer for what Atlanta was throwing at them. But here is the part that every single person watching this video needs to understand. We saw footage of Stephanie White scolding Caitlin Clark on the sideline. And here is the timeline that matters. That scolding happened before the turnovers took place. After Caitlin Clark scored a basket in the third quarter, she scored, she made a play, and her own head coach was in her ear, on the sideline with the cameras watching. Not after a turnover, after a made basket. Let that sink in for a second. The coach was correcting the most important player on the team after she did something right. And then after the game, when the turnovers did come, because turnovers come in basketball, they come for every player on every team in every league on earth. Stephanie White used them as a public cudgel to shift the blame away from her own coaching decisions and onto the shoulders of a player who was already carrying this franchise on her back. That is not coaching. That is something else entirely. That is a head coach who has decided she does not trust her best player. And the evidence of that decision is now showing up in the way the Fever are preparing to play going forward. Because here is what the reporting and the analysis of this situation is telling us. Stephanie White is pivoting. She is moving away from the Caitlin Clark-centered offense, the up-tempo, push-pace, get the ball in Clark's hands and let her operate system, and she is moving back toward Kelsey Mitchell as the offensive focal point. The same Kelsey Mitchell who wants to get her 20 points and does not want to pass the ball to anybody. The same Kelsey Mitchell who was in MVP conversation last year, earned first-team All-NBA honors, and has found it extremely difficult to transition back into a complementary role now that the most famous player in the league is her teammate. Stephanie White sees Mitchell as less turnover-prone. She sees her as a safer bet, and that framing alone tells you everything you need to know about how Stephanie White thinks about basketball. Because she is choosing the safe bet over the right bet, the comfortable bet over the winning bet, and in doing so, she is choosing to lose. Don't take my word for it. Here is the analysis of exactly what Stephanie White appears to believe about Caitlin Clark's style of play.
She does not believe the risk is worth the reward. The lemon's not worth the squeeze.
She does not believe the risk is worth the reward. That is the operating philosophy of the head coach of the Indiana Fever right now. She has looked at Caitlin Clark, the player who is responsible for every meaningful commercial and cultural development this franchise has experienced in the last 2 years, and she has decided the risk is not worth the reward. There is no spin to put on that. There is no charitable interpretation of that framing. That is a head coach who has given up on her best player's style of play and is now engineering a roster construction and offensive system designed to minimize that player's impact rather than maximize it.
Caitlin Clark should have had 40-point explosions, but
now I want to walk you through exactly why this decision is not just wrong, it is catastrophically, soul-crushingly, organizationally ruinous. And I want to do it by looking at 4 specific failures that are already on the board as a direct result of the direction Stephanie White is taking this franchise. The first failure is the identity collapse. This Indiana Fever team has no identity, none, zero. 1 week they are playing up and down, pushing tempo, running in transition, operating the way Caitlin Clark's game demands. The next week they are walking the ball up the court, running isolation after isolation for Kelsey Mitchell, watching the shot clock drain while Mitchell dribbles at the top of the key looking for a crease that is never going to open. These are 2 completely different basketball philosophies. They are not compatible. You cannot run a Caitlin Clark offense and a Kelsey Mitchell offense in the same season, in the same game out of the same playbook. You have to choose. And the brutal reality is that Stephanie White has not chosen, or rather she has chosen, and the choice she is making is the wrong one. And she does not even have the courage to announce it clearly. She is letting it leak out through her post-game comments, through her scolding on the sideline, through the minutes distribution and the play-calling tendencies. The team has no backbone, no consistency, no direction, and every single one of those failures traces directly back to the coaching staff. The second failure is the roster mismanagement. Let me talk to you about the Indiana Fever bench, because it is a disaster that Stephanie White owns completely. Amber Cox, not playable. Ty Harris, not playable. Michaela Timpson, not playable in meaningful situations. These are players who cannot guard their assignments, cannot create offense, cannot be trusted in crunch time. And then there is Monique Billings, $800,000. That is what the Indiana Fever are paying Monique Billings. $800,000, and she is playing 13 minutes a game. 13 minutes. That was your marquee offseason acquisition. That was the player the front office went out and got to upgrade this roster. And your head coach does not trust her enough to give her real minutes, does not believe in her enough to put her in a position to actually impact the game. You pay someone $800,000 and you play them 13 minutes. That is not a roster problem. That is a coaching problem. That is a trust problem. That is a head coach who is so locked into her own comfort zone that she cannot even deploy her own acquisitions effectively. The third failure is what Stephanie White has done to Aaliyah Boston. And this one is particularly brutal, because Aaliyah Boston is a genuinely talented basketball player who is earning $6 million a year and is being systematically misused to the point where she has forgotten how to play her own game. Aaliyah Boston getting $6 million. $6 million. And she is getting outplayed by players who are not even starters on their respective teams. She got outplayed by Angel Reese, and that is a name that deserves respect. Angel Reese is a real player. But she also got outplayed by Naz Hillman, who is coming off the bench for the Atlanta Dream. Naz Hillman is not the starter. Bri Jones is the starter for Atlanta, and she was out with injury. So the Fever's $6 million center got outplayed by a backup center in back-to-back games. And the reason, the documented, observable, undeniable reason, is that Stephanie White has turned Aaliyah Boston into a hub, a facilitator, a ball movement piece. She has pulled Boston away from the paint, pulled her away from the 8 to 10 foot bunnies that are the bread and butter of her game, and turned her into a perimeter-oriented offensive hub. And now Boston is missing layups, missing the shots that should be automatic for a player of her caliber. Stephanie White has coached the instincts out of her own starting center, and nobody in the building is saying a word about it. The fourth failure is the foul problem. This team bails opponents out on late shot clocks by fouling. They give up and ones because when they do foul, they do not foul hard enough to prevent the shot from going in. They give up soft and ones, halfway fouls, touch fouls that accomplish nothing except putting the opponent on the free throw line. And the defensive scheme, or the absence of one, means the guards are constantly getting attacked one-on-one with no help coming, no rotation, no zone wrinkle to disrupt the rhythm of what opposing offenses are trying to do. Stephanie White has been asked directly about defensive adjustments in post-game press conferences, and the reporting suggests she sounds like a coach who has run out of options. A coach who has exhausted her playbook. A coach who does not have a second or third defensive look to go to when the primary scheme is getting carved up. That is terrifying. That is not a head coach operating at the level this roster demands. And now let me give you the second receipt, because the most damning part of this story is not just what Stephanie White is doing to the team's identity. It is what she has done specifically to Caitlin Clark's opportunities. Listen to this.
Skill. Aaliyah Boston has to get back to being a dominant in the paint player. Stephanie White has...
The last 2 games, Caitlin Clark should have had 40-point explosions, but she was stopped by her coach and teammates. Stopped by her own coach and her own teammates. Not by the defense, not by a brilliant opposing game plan. Stopped internally, from within the building, by the people who are supposed to be creating the conditions for her to succeed. That is the admission, that is the evidence, that is what is happening inside the Indiana Fever right now, and it is absolutely unconscionable. I want to be very clear about something, because this is the part of the story that television will not tell you, and that the league's promotional machine absolutely does not want you sitting with. Caitlin Clark is not the problem in Indiana. Caitlin Clark has never been the problem in Indiana. Caitlin Clark is the reason this franchise matters. She is the reason the seats are filled. She is the reason the cameras are there. She is the reason we are having this conversation at all. And what Stephanie White is doing, this deliberate, calculated pivot away from Clark's style of play, this recommitment to Kelsey Mitchell as the offensive priority, is not a basketball decision. It is a power decision. It is a head coach asserting control over a situation where she feels her authority is being overshadowed by a player whose star power dwarfs everything else in the building. Because let us be brutally honest about the Kelsey Mitchell situation. Kelsey Mitchell is a talented basketball player. She was in MVP conversations last season. She earned first-team All-NBA. Those accomplishments are real and they deserve acknowledgement. But Kelsey Mitchell does not want to pass the ball. Every single person who has watched this team with honest eyes knows this. She wants her 20 points. She wants her isolation touches. She wants to be the star. And that was fine. That was the system. That was the identity. Before Caitlin Clark arrived and changed the entire calculus of what this team could be. The problem is that Kelsey Mitchell has found it extremely difficult to accept a complementary role. And Stephanie White, rather than managing that dynamic with the authority a head coach is supposed to have, is capitulating to it. She is rewarding the player who wants to be the star over the player who is actually making the team better, making the league better, making the sport better. And the Phoenix Mercury game is the perfect lens to examine this through. The Mercury are 5-12. They are not a good team. They are a team the Fever should beat. But the Fever are not a good team either, and that is the brutal truth that Stephanie White's coaching decisions have produced. Look at Indiana's schedule. The teams they have beaten are teams at 500 or below. The 2 quality wins they have are against the Valkyries and the Dream, 1 game each. That is not a championship caliber record. That is a team that beats the teams it is supposed to beat and struggles against anyone with real talent. And the reason, the undeniable, glaring, mathematical reason, is that this team has no consistent identity, no consistent offensive system, and a head coach who is actively working against her own best player. The Mercury do have weapons that can exploit Indiana's defensive vulnerabilities. Alyssa Thomas is an Olympian. Kalea Copper is averaging close to 20 points a game and she plays both ends. Copper is a scorer in the mold of Kelsey Mitchell. Every time she touches the ball, she is looking to attack. If the Fever's defense does not get Copper under control, if they keep giving up soft fouls and ones, if they keep letting opposing guards attack them one-on-one with no help rotation, Copper can absolutely go off. And if Copper goes off against a team that has no offensive answer because their head coach has decided to run isolation sets for a player who does not want to pass, that is a loss. That is a completely avoidable loss that becomes inevitable the moment Stephanie White refuses to put the ball in Caitlin Clark's hands and let her operate. Here is the third receipt, and this one is about what Stephanie White has specifically done to the players around Caitlin Clark. The systematic dismantling of the conditions that make Clark's game work. Stephanie White has ruined her to the point where it's nice that she can step out and make a three. That is what this coaching staff has produced. A $6 million center who has been coached so far away from her natural game that the best thing you can say about her now is that she can occasionally knock down a perimeter shot. Stephanie White has taken a dominant interior player and turned her into a perimeter facilitator, and in doing so has stripped away the one thing that made Aaliyah Boston genuinely dangerous: her ability to punish teams in the paint. That is not development, that is regression. That is a head coach who is so committed to her own offensive system that she is willing to sacrifice the individual development and effectiveness of her own players to maintain it. And Caitlin Clark is watching this happen. She is watching her teammates get coached into diminished versions of themselves, and she is being blamed for the losses that result. Let me give you my verdict on where this is going, because I think the trajectory of this situation is clear and I want to be on record about it before the next chapter of this story unfolds. First, Stephanie White's job security is genuinely at risk, and it should be. I want every single person watching this video to understand that a head coach who publicly shifts blame onto her best player after a loss, a head coach who scolds that player on the sideline after a made basket, not a turnover, a made basket, a head coach who then pivots the entire offensive philosophy of the team away from that player in response to a single bad game. That head coach is not operating with the judgment this franchise requires. The Indiana Fever front office has to be watching this. They have to be asking the questions that the post-game press conferences are not answering, because the evidence is accumulating and it is accumulating fast. Second, Caitlin Clark is not going to disappear. She is not going to shrink. She is not going to become a role player in a Kelsey Mitchell isolation offense. She is too talented, too competitive, too self-aware to let this situation swallow her. What you are going to see, what I am predicting right now on record, is that the tension between Clark's natural game and Stephanie White's preferred system is going to reach a breaking point. It is going to become visible. It is going to become undeniable in a way that even the most casual observer cannot miss. And when that moment arrives, the Indiana Fever front office is going to have to make a choice: the player or the coach, the future or the comfort, the right answer or the safe answer. Third, the Kelsey Mitchell situation is not sustainable. I want to be fair to Kelsey Mitchell here, because she is a real basketball player and her accomplishments are legitimate. But you cannot build a winning offense in the modern WNBA around isolation basketball. You cannot win with one player dribbling the shot clock down and pulling up from mid-range while four teammates stand and watch. That is not a system. That is a prayer. And it is a prayer that Stephanie White has chosen to answer at the expense of the most dynamic playmaker in the league. The teams that are going to compete for championships in this league are the teams with pace, with ball movement, with players who make decisions quickly and trust each other. The Indiana Fever, under Stephanie White's current direction, are moving in the exact opposite direction. They are slowing down, they are standing still, they are dribbling while the clock runs out and the opportunity disappears. Fourth, the bench situation has to change, and it has to change now. You cannot play meaningful basketball with a roster where multiple players are simply not deployable in competitive situations. Amber Cox, Ty Harris, Michaela Timpson, if these players cannot be trusted in real game situations, then the coaching staff has to find a way to develop them, or the front office has to find replacements. Paying Monique Billings $800,000 and playing her 13 minutes is not a solution. It is a symptom. It is a symptom of a coaching staff that does not trust its own personnel decisions, does not have a development pipeline, and does not have a coherent plan for how to build a competitive rotation. And through all of this, through every bad game, every confusing lineup decision, every post-game press conference where accountability goes missing, Caitlin Clark is still showing up. She is still competing. She is still the most dangerous offensive player on this roster, by a distance that is not even close. In back-to-back games, she was on the verge of 40-point performances. 40 points, and she was stopped, not by the defense, not by her own limitations, but by the system she is being forced to play in and the people who are supposed to be building that system around her. That is the story. That is the brutal, undeniable, soul-crushing reality of what is happening in Indiana right now. Caitlin Clark is ready to explode, and Stephanie White is standing in the doorway with her arms out, blocking the exit. The moment that Indiana Fever decide to get out of Caitlin Clark's way, genuinely, structurally, philosophically get out of her way, this team becomes dangerous. The moment they commit to pushing tempo off made baskets, to running in transition, to putting the ball in Clark's hands in the open court and letting her make decisions, this team becomes genuinely competitive. That is not a complicated formula. It is not a secret. Every analyst, every observer, every person who has watched this team with honest eyes can see it. The only person in the building who appears unable or unwilling to see it is Stephanie White. And that is the most terrifying thing about this entire situation. Not that the Fever are struggling, not that the roster has holes, not that Kelsey Mitchell wants to be the star. The most terrifying thing is that the head coach of the Indiana Fever has looked at Caitlin Clark, the most important player in the history of this franchise, one of the most important players in the history of this league, and decided that the risk is not worth the reward. She said it, with cameras rolling, after everything we have watched. She said it, and until that changes, until Stephanie White either reverses course or is replaced by someone who can see what is directly in front of them, the Indiana Fever are going to keep grinding through a season that should be historic and keep producing results that are mediocre. Caitlin Clark deserves better, the fans deserve better, and the league deserves better. Here is the forced choice I am leaving you with today, and I want you to get down in the comments and tell me exactly where you stand. Do you believe Stephanie White should be given more time to figure this out? That the pivot back to Kelsey Mitchell is a short-term adjustment that will correct itself? Or do you believe the Indiana Fever front office needs to step in right now and make it absolutely clear that Caitlin Clark is the offensive priority, non-negotiable, end of discussion? That is the choice. That is the only question that matters in Indiana right now. Not the Phoenix Mercury game, not the schedule, not the bench rotation. The question is, who is this team built around, and who is going to have the courage to answer it? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to see this conversation. Subscribe if you are not already here, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you do not miss the next time we pull the curtain back on what is actually happening in women's basketball. This is Rim Run. We will see you on the next one.